One name surfaces, and everything unravels. Welcome to Clue Lore. I am your host, Vale. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you for being here. Straight into the story. If you're looking for the moment the brownstone first got its hackles up, I could give you a nice dramatic choice. Like the instant the bell rang, or the instant Nero Wolfe's eyes narrowed, or the instant I realized the name on the card was one that shouldn't exist. But drama is for people who don't know where their next meal is coming from. The first real disturbance was a smell, not the kind that sends you reaching for a window, nothing crude. It was rosemary, sharp and clean, riding in on the draft when I opened the front door. Rosemary at 3:15 in the afternoon meant Fritz Brenner was in one of his moods. There are moods, and there are moods. Fritz's moods had herbs. I stood there a second with my hand still on the knob and let it wash over me. If you've never been hungry in a warm hallway full of cooking smells, you've missed one of the more civilized tortures. On a workday, the torture was worse because it came with rules. Wolfe's rules. Fritz's rules. The house's rules. Even the orchids upstairs had rules, and if you think I'm joking, you haven't watched Nero Wolfe scowl at a bloom that dared to open a day early. I shut the door softly. No slamming, another rule. And started toward the office with my hat still on, because I'd just come in from a little midtown errand that had involved a bank, a stiff-necked clerk, and the mild pleasure of watching a man realize his signature wasn't as important as he thought. The office door was ajar. That alone was enough to make me slow down. Wolfe kept the door open when he was expecting someone. Otherwise, it was a closed door, like a closed mouth. Not always hostile, but always deliberate. I pushed it with 2 fingers and slipped in. Wolfe was in his chair, naturally, wearing the yellow silk pajama jacket that meant he didn't intend to move any farther than the distance from his hand to his beer. He wasn't drinking beer yet. That came later, when he decided the universe had earned it. His hands were folded on his belly like 2 well-fed animals taking a nap, and his eyes were on the desk. Not on me. That was the second disturbance. I crossed to my desk and dropped into my chair, letting the spring say hello. Something wrong with the furniture. He didn't look up. A name. That was the third disturbance, and the one that mattered. Wolfe didn't do small talk about names. Names were labels for people, and people were, at best, an interruption between Wolfe and his orchids. I leaned forward. There was a card on his desk, the plain white kind you'd expect from an undertaker or a man with no imagination. A name was printed in black, neat, restrained. Mr. Edward S. Klein. I stared at it long enough to be sure it wasn't going to change. Then I smiled because my face sometimes does that when my brain runs into a wall. That's a fine name. It is impossible, Wolfe said. He said it with the calm certainty of a man announcing that water is wet. Not dramatic, not angry, just settled. Wolfe had a talent for making statements sound like law. I reached over, took the card, and held it up like a playing card. I met a Klein once. He sold shoes in Newark and lied about the leather. This is not Newark, Wolfe said, and the man in my anteroom is not a shoe merchant. How do you know? I asked. You haven't seen him. I have heard him, Wolfe said, finally lifting his eyes to mine. They were pale and steady and annoyed, like the eyes of a cat that has discovered a dog in its kitchen, and because he has employed the one method certain to bring him through my door. That got my attention. Which method is that? He has used the name. I let that roll around. The bell hadn't rung. That was true. I'd come in and found the office door open, meaning someone was expected, meaning someone had already rung the bell while I was out and had already talked to someone, likely to Fritz, because Fritz was the one who answered when I wasn't around. Wait, I said. You're telling me you've got a man sitting in the anteroom right now who handed Fritz a card with that name on it, and Fritz let him in? Fritz, Wolfe said, is not a fool. That was one of Wolfe's gentler insults. Fritz didn't like fools. He fed them because he fed everyone, but he didn't like them. If Fritz had let someone in with a nonsense name, it meant there was more to it. I stood up. All right, I'll take a look at this impossible man. Wolfe's mouth tightened. Do not conduct an inquisition. Bring him. That's what I do, I said. I bring them. Sometimes they stick. I went to the door and stepped into the front room. The anteroom was quiet in that way it gets when the house is holding its breath. Fritz stood near the hall table, hands folded, expression polite and unreadable. If Fritz had been a poker player, Wolfe would have been out of business. On the sofa sat a man who looked like he'd been told once, often, that he should sit up straight, and had obeyed. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with hair the color of old paper and a face that had learned to keep its opinions tucked away. His suit was conservative, dark, well cut, and worn as if it had been tailored to him years ago, and then maintained with care. His hands were on his knees. Not fidgeting, not relaxed. Placed. That's a tell, by the way. When a man places his hands, he's either military, trained, or trying to convince you he's not nervous. Sometimes all three. He looked at me and gave a small nod that was almost a bow. Mr. Goodwin, I paused. You've got the advantage. I've listened, he said. One learns. I glanced at Fritz. Fritz's expression did not change, which was his way of confirming the universe. I pointed at the office door with my chin. Mr. Wolfe is ready. The man rose smoothly. No joint complaints, no hesitation. He moved like a person who'd practiced moving without asking permission. As we crossed the threshold, I felt the brownstone's mood shift a fraction. Wolfe's office is a room that knows its master. Some rooms are furniture and air. Wolfe's office is an attitude. Wolfe looked at the man without any welcome in his face. Sit down, he said. The man sat in the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk, the one that has held more desperate postures than a confession booth. He sat upright, not leaning back into the leather. Again, placed. Wolfe's gaze went to the card on his desk, though I was holding it now. You have offered a name, Wolfe said, that should not exist. The man's eyes flickered. Just a blink of something. Recognition, irritation, sorrow. I am aware of the effect. That awareness, Wolfe said, does not explain the impertinence. The man didn't bristle, which meant he had either pride of steel or the humility of someone who knew his position was weak. He said, It is not impertinence, it is necessity. Wolfe made a small sound. Not quite a snort, not quite a sigh. Wolfe had a whole vocabulary of noises he used for people who were wasting his time. I sat at my desk, took out my notebook, and uncapped my pen. If Wolfe wanted to call it necessity, I was ready to spell it. Wolfe said, Mr. Klein, you will speak. The man looked at Wolfe, then at me, then back. I will begin with a correction. Edward S. Klein is not my legal name. Wolfe's eyes narrowed a millimeter. Then you have lied at my threshold. I have used, the man said carefully, a name that has meaning in this house. I felt the hair on the back of my neck do that thing it does when the air turns. Wolfe said, Continue. The man's voice stayed even, but there was a tightness under it now, like a string drawn too far. I am here because a document exists that should not exist. Wolfe's eyelids lowered slightly. He was listening now. A man can insult Wolfe all day with flattery and requests and sob stories, and Wolfe will sit like a stone. Mention something that should not exist, and you have his attention. Wolfe took impossibilities personally. The man reached into his inside coat pocket. Slow, deliberate, not making Wolfe think he was drawing a weapon. Anybody who had ever been in a room with Wolfe and Archie Goodwin knew that the most dangerous thing in it was Wolfe's brain, and the second most dangerous was me, if I felt like it. He withdrew a plain envelope, thick. He placed it on Wolfe's desk without sliding it like it might stain the wood. Wolfe did not touch it. I leaned forward. That looks like paper in an envelope. Lots of things exist like that. The man turned his head toward me. Not this one. Wolfe said, Mr. Goodwin will refrain. His eyes remained on the envelope as if it were a beetle with the audacity to crawl onto his desk. The man said, inside that envelope is a name that was removed from the world 15 years ago. Wolfe's mouth tightened again. Names are not removed. People are removed. The man's gaze dropped to his own hands. For the first time, his fingers moved. One thumb rubbed over the knuckle of the other hand. Small, almost hidden. Yes, he said softly. People are removed. Wolfe said nothing. The man looked up. Mr. Wolfe, I'm not here about murder. That might have been a relief, if Wolfe ever did relief. In Wolfe's view, murder is a nuisance that brings police, and police bring questions, and questions bring interruptions, and interruptions bring indigestion. But Wolfe also had a professional interest in the clean finality of a murder. It was hard to argue with a dead body. Not being about murder meant the mess would be more elastic. The man continued, I'm here about a will. That made me sit back. Now we're talking. Money is a language Wolfe speaks fluently, even if he pretends it's vulgar. Wolfe's gaze finally lifted to the man's face. Wills are the province of attorneys. I have attorneys, the man said. They are the ones who told me to come here. That was a surprise. Not because attorneys recommend Wolfe. Some do when they need a problem solved without leaving fingerprints, but because the man said it like he didn't trust their advice. Wolfe said, Then your attorneys are incompetent, or you are withholding information. The man's lips pressed together. They are competent, and I am withholding nothing. Wolfe stared at him in the manner Wolfe uses when he wants to see whether a man will fall apart under the weight of being examined. Most men do. The ones who don't are either worth the trouble or too dangerous to ignore. This one didn't fall apart. He blinked once and his jaw set a fraction, but his eyes stayed steady. Wolfe said, Your name. The man hesitated. Not long. Just long enough to show that what he was about to say mattered. Daniel, he said. Daniel Barstow. That name meant nothing to me. If he'd said Rockefeller, I'd have raised an eyebrow. Barstow was just Barstow. Wolfe, however, didn't move. But something in his eyes shifted. If you've been around Wolfe long enough, you learn to recognize the shift that says a file drawer has been opened in his mind. He said very quietly, Barstow. Daniel Barstow nodded once. Yes. Wolfe's eyes dropped again to the envelope. And the name within? Barstow swallowed, and that was the first real sign of strain. It is the name of my daughter. That landed on the carpet between us like a dropped glass, not shattering, but letting you know it could. Wolfe's voice remained flat. You have a daughter. I had, Barstow said. Her name was... He stopped. His throat moved. Her name was Helen. Wolfe's face did not soften. Wolfe's face doesn't do soft, but he sat a fraction straighter, which for Wolfe was practically lunging. Barstow continued, words now coming like he'd rehearsed them and still hated them. 15 years ago, my daughter disappeared. She was 23. There was no body, no proof, no anything, just absence. I wrote Helen Barstow, disappeared 15 years in my notebook and underlined it. Barstow said, the police did what they do. They asked questions, made assumptions, and after a year they stopped calling. People told me to accept it, to move on, to bury her in my mind if nowhere else. His eyes held Wolfe's now. I did not. Wolfe said, "You have come to me 15 years late." Barstow's jaw tightened. "No. I have come to you at the moment it became impossible to ignore." "Explain," Wolfe said. Barstow put a hand, carefully, on the envelope. 2 months ago, my brother died. I waited for Wolfe to react. He didn't. He would have reacted more if Barstow had told him the orchids were being watered with tap water. Barstow went on. "My brother, Thomas, and I have been estranged. He disliked my wife. He resented my success. He believed the Barstow name belonged to him. He never forgave me for being the older one. Sibling rivalry. That's a classic. It's also messy and endless. Thomas left a will," Barstow said. "He left it with conditions, and in it—" His fingers pressed the envelope down as if it might float away. "In it, he named Helen." Wolfe's eyes narrowed again. "He named a missing woman." "He named her," Barstow said, and his voice finally cracked a little. "Not as missing, as alive." That did it. I felt the brownstone stiffen. Fritz in the doorway didn't move, but his attention sharpened. Wolfe became still in a deeper way, like a machine shifting into a higher gear without making noise. Wolfe said, "And therefore the name should not exist." "Yes," Barstow said. "Helen's name is on a legal document filed properly, witnessed, notarized. My attorneys confirmed it. A court clerk confirmed it. It exists." Wolfe's voice was controlled, but there was weight in it. "Mr. Barstow, why is this my concern?" Barstow looked directly at Wolfe. "Because the will contains a bequest that cannot be executed unless Helen appears, or unless she is declared dead in a manner that satisfies the condition." Wolfe said, "That is again a matter for attorneys." They said the same. Barstow replied, "Until they read the condition." Wolfe's eyes did not blink. "What condition?" Barstow breathed out slowly, as if releasing something he'd been holding in his lungs for weeks. "Thomas wrote that Helen would inherit the Barstow house on East 69th Street, his house, on the anniversary of her disappearance. That date is in 9 days. 9 days. Tight, convenient, suspicious." Barstow continued, "If Helen does not appear, the house goes to Thomas's foundation, a foundation run by the people who are closest to him, people who have interests," Wolfe said. "Interests?" Barstow nodded. "The house is worth—" He paused, maybe realizing Wolfe didn't care about numbers until he decided to. "It is very valuable. In money and in influence." Wolfe's lips pressed together, then parted. "You suspect fraud." Barstow's eyes flashed. "I suspect something far worse than fraud. I suspect my brother knew something about Helen. I suspect he wrote that condition as bait. I suspect—" His voice tightened again. "I suspect my daughter is either alive somewhere under another name or dead somewhere under none." Wolfe looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Why have you used the name Klein?" Barstow's eyes flickered to me, then back. "Because 15 years ago, when Helen disappeared, you were consulted." I froze. Wolfe didn't. He merely said, "I was not." Barstow's face went pale. "Yes, you were." Wolfe's tone sharpened. "I assure you, sir, I was not." Barstow swallowed. "Then someone lied to me." Wolfe's eyes stayed hard. "Or you lied to me." Barstow sat perfectly still, hands flat on his knees again. "I'm not lying. I came to this house once, 15 years ago. I sat in that chair. I spoke to a man behind that desk." I felt my pen hover over the paper. Wolfe said, "And that man was not I." Barstow's mouth opened, then closed. "He looked like you," he said, and it sounded like confession. "He spoke like you. He had the same certainty, the same contempt. He told me he could not help me. He told me to go away and accept reality. He told me—" Barstow's eyes lowered. He told me my daughter had chosen to vanish, and that if I was wise, I would let her. I stared at Wolfe. Wolfe stared at Barstow. Fritz made a small sound in the doorway. Not a word, not a cough. Just a note of disapproval, like a chef hearing someone insult butter. Wolfe's voice, when it came, was very calm. "Mr. Barstow, you have brought into my house a notion that is repugnant." Barstow looked up sharply. "Repugnant?" Wolfe leaned back a fraction. "That someone has used my appearance, my voice, my manner, my identity, as a tool. That someone has offered counsel under my name. That someone has turned my brownstone into a stage for a deception." Barstow's face tightened. "I didn't mean—" Wolfe cut him off. "I know what you meant. You meant that a man sat where I sit and pretended to be Nero Wolfe." He looked at me, and in that glance was an order, a warning, and an irritation all at once. "Archie." "Yes, sir," I said, though my mind was already sprinting. Wolfe turned back to Barstow. "You say you came here 15 years ago. You say the man you met was not I. You say he told you your daughter vanished by choice. You say now your deceased brother has written a will that treats her as alive, with a condition that must be satisfied in 9 days. He paused, and the room seemed to pause with him. "Mr. Barstow," Wolfe said, "your case is not about a will. It is about an imposture. It is about an intrusion into my sanctuary. It is about a name that should not exist." Barstow's eyes widened slightly. "Then you will help me?" Wolfe's mouth tightened again. "I have not said so." Barstow's shoulders sank a fraction, as if he'd expected the denial, and it still hurt. "I will pay," he said quietly. "Whatever you require." Wolfe's eyes flicked to the envelope, then away. Money is not the primary issue. That was true. Money would be an issue. Wolfe liked money. Wolfe liked money the way Fritz liked knives. Kept sharp, respected, and used properly. But Wolfe's primary issue was always Wolfe. I said, "All right, Mr. Barstow, let's say we take it. What do you want exactly? Your daughter found, the will stopped, your brother's people exposed, a ghost chased out of your family attic?" Barstow looked at me, and for the first time his control faltered enough for something raw to show through. "I want the truth," he said. "If Helen is alive, I want to know why she disappeared and who kept her hidden. If she is dead, I want to know who made her that way. And if my brother used your name—" His eyes went to Wolfe. "I want that answer too." Wolfe's gaze stayed on him, heavy. Then Wolfe reached at last for the envelope. He did it slowly, as if claiming territory. He slid it toward himself and tapped it once with his finger. "Fritz," Wolfe said without looking away, "bring beer." Fritz left without a sound. That was Wolfe's way of telling me he had decided something, even if he hadn't said it yet. Wolfe didn't ask for beer when he was refusing a case. Beer was for contemplation, for strategy, for the moment after the door closes and the game begins. Barstow watched Wolfe, hopeful and wary. Wolfe said, "Mr. Barstow, I will read what is in this envelope. Then I will ask questions. Then I will decide whether to involve myself." Barstow exhaled. "Thank you." Wolfe's eyes sharpened. "Do not thank me. You have already offended me." Barstow looked confused. Wolfe continued, voice like a clean blade. "By bringing into my house a name that should not exist." He opened the envelope with a finger, extracted a sheaf of papers, and began to read without moving anything but his eyes. I sat back and watched him, because that's what you do when Wolfe reads. You watch the face, not the paper. The face tells you when the room is about to change. As Wolfe's eyes moved down the page, the corners of his mouth tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. His brow dipped slightly. Not anger, not shock. Something colder. Recognition. He looked up at me. "Archie," he said, Yes. Wolfe tapped the paper with one thick finger. This document bears a signature I have seen before. I didn't like the way he said it. I liked it even less because he looked almost pleased. Wolfe got pleased the way other men get hungry, quietly and with intent. What signature? I asked. Wolfe's eyes returned to the page. The witness, one of them. He read the name aloud. Edwin S. Klein. I stared at him. Barstow stared at him. The brownstone, if it could stare, would have. I said carefully, "That's the name on the card." Wolfe's eyes did not leave the page. "Indeed." Barstow's voice came out rough. Is that a person?" Wolfe finally looked up, and his gaze was like a verdict. It was. He set the papers down with great care, as if they were contagious. "Mr. Barstow," Wolfe said, "you have brought me a name that should not exist." He paused, letting the silence do work. "And now," he said, "I must discover why it does." I closed my notebook because the hook had set and the line was pulling. Outside the office, Fritz returned with beer, and the smell of rosemary followed him like a promise that dinner would still happen even if the world was coming apart. That's the thing about the brownstone. It holds its rituals like armor, but armor doesn't mean you can't feel the knife when it slips in. And somewhere in the city, maybe in a foundation office on 69th Street, maybe in a law clerk's filing cabinet, maybe in a memory that had been carefully buried, someone had used Nero Wolfe's name like a tool. If you think that doesn't make Wolfe dangerous, you've never seen a man defend his sanctuary without leaving his chair. Fritz set the beer down on Wolfe's desk with the reverence of a man placing a chalice on an altar, and the smell of rosemary rode in behind him like a quiet reminder that the universe still expected us to behave. Wolfe lifted the bottle, regarded it a moment as if deciding whether it deserved his lips, and then drank. Not a gulp. Wolfe doesn't gulp. A measured swallow that said he had accepted responsibility for the next hour. He set the bottle down and looked across at Daniel Barstow. "You will remain," he said. Barstow blinked. "Of course." Wolfe's eyes slid to me. "And you will begin." That was Wolfe's idea of distributing labor. He provided gravity, I provided traction. I opened my notebook again and let my pen hover. "All right," I said to Barstow. 15 years ago, you came here, you sat there. A man who wasn't Wolfe told you to go away and accept reality. How did you find him? Who referred you?" Barstow shifted slightly, the first real movement he'd allowed himself in minutes. "A banker, a friend. He said Mr. Wolfe was discreet and formidable." "That banker have a name?" I asked. Barstow's eyes flicked to Wolfe and back. "Harold Meacham." Wolfe made no sound, which didn't mean he didn't register it. If you ever want to know whether Wolfe recognizes a name, don't look for a nod. Look for nothing. Wolfe's nothing is loud. "And Meacham gave you this address?" I asked. "Yes." "Did you speak to anyone else here besides the imposter?" I asked. "Fritz? Me? Anyone?" Barstow shook his head. "No, the man opened the door." I put a little star in my notebook. "Describe him." Barstow hesitated, then said, "He was tall, perhaps your height, Mr. Goodwin. Dark hair, younger than you. He wore a suit. He asked my name, took my card, and led me directly in. He did not speak much." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "A stranger in my house," he murmured, like tasting vinegar. I said, "You're sure it was this house? Same layout, same red chair, same—" I gestured at Wolfe's desk and the shelves behind him. Barstow's mouth tightened. "I'm not a man given to confusing places. It was this house, that desk, that chair, that man." Wolfe's fingers tapped once on the paper. "Proceed, Archie." "Okay," I said. "You met the imposter. He told you to accept reality. Did he ask you for anything? Money? Documents? Names? Barstow's eyes lowered. He asked for details. Where Helen was last seen. Her acquaintances. My brother's feelings about her. Whether she had money of her own. That last part pinged. Did she? She did, Barstow said. Her grandmother left her a trust. How much? I asked. Barstow's jaw tightened. Enough to tempt. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. And you told the impostor the amount? Yes. I looked at Wolfe. He looked as if he'd discovered a grub in his orchid soil. Barstow continued, almost eager to defend himself. He asked for a photograph of Helen. I had one with me. I gave it to him. I stopped writing. You gave him the only photograph you had with you. I assumed, Barstow began. You assumed he was Wolfe, I finished. Did he give it back? No. Wolfe's voice went flat. Then you paid him with information and an image. Barstow's face reddened a fraction. I did not pay him with money. Wolfe regarded him. Money is not the only currency. There was a silence while Barstow swallowed his pride and Wolfe swallowed nothing. Fritz, in the doorway, stayed still, but I saw his eyes flick to the envelope on Wolfe's desk as if he didn't like it sitting there. I said, what happened after that meeting? Did the impostor contact you? Any letters? Calls? Barstow shook his head. Nothing. I returned to my attorneys. I continued searching on my own. Private investigators, agencies. I exhausted every respectable avenue. And the disreputable? I asked. His mouth tightened. Some of those too. Wolfe took another sip of beer. Then for 15 years this matter has remained dormant until your brother's will revived it. Yes, Barstow said. And the will is abnormal. It is not merely the condition. There are details. References Helen could not know unless she had been in contact with Thomas recently. That got me. Such as? Barstow pointed to the papers. A phrase. The lilacs by the north wall. Wolfe's eyes flickered to the line Barstow indicated. I leaned, read it, and felt my scalp tighten. What's that mean? I asked. Barstow's voice dropped. When Helen was a child, she and Thomas planted lilacs by the north wall of the house. It was their secret. No one else knew. When I remodeled the garden 10 years ago, I asked Thomas about the lilacs. He told me they had never existed. Wolfe's gaze stayed on the paper, and yet the will refers to them. Yes, that was the kind of detail that made a man's skin itch. It wasn't proof, but it was a hook, something only the right person, or a person who had talked to the right person, could know. I said, who are the people closest to him who run this foundation? Barstow's eyes hardened, and now we were closer to the live wire. 3 trustees, also the executor. Thomas liked to surround himself with loyalists. Names, I said. He gave them, steady but with distaste. Margot Vale, attorney. She handled Thomas's affairs for years. Lionel Cray, director of the foundation, he calls himself an urban preservationist. And Dr. Sloane Mercer, a psychiatrist, if you can believe it. A psychiatrist, I repeated. Nice. Always handy for explaining why other people behave badly. Wolfe's lip curled slightly. Or for encouraging them to. Barstow went on. The executor is a man named Peter Jansen. He worked with Thomas. Investments, holdings, that sort of thing. I wrote each name down and underlined them. 4 people. 4 possible motives. 4 possible opportunities to manufacture a will condition that would divert a valuable townhouse into their control. Wolfe said, and your brother's death? Natural. Barstow's eyes flickered. Heart failure? Sudden, but he was not young. There was an autopsy at my request. Results? I asked. Natural, Barstow said. His jaw tightened again. But natural is sometimes a convenient word. Wolfe's eyes returned to Barstow. In 9 days the condition matures. Where are these persons now? Barstow shook his head. Cray is in the city. Vale is in the city. Jansen is in the city. Mercer is somewhere upstate, I believe. She has a practice and retreats. Wolfe grunted. All accessible. Then he did something that made me sit up straighter. He turned the papers slightly so they were square with his desk, as if aligning them aligned the world. Mr. Barstow, Wolfe said, you will answer precisely. Have you received any communication in the last 2 months suggesting Helen's return? Barstow hesitated, and the hesitation was the loudest thing he'd done yet. Wolfe's eyes went cold. Ah. Barstow's hands clenched once on his knees and released. Yes. I kept my voice mild. What kind of communication? A note, he said. Typed. No signature. It arrived at my office. Wolfe's gaze stayed fixed. Contents. Barstow swallowed. It said, "Stop digging. You're not the only one who can lose a daughter." That turned the air in the room like the heat shutting off. Fritz's face remained composed, but I saw his jaw tighten, which on Fritz is practically a fist fight. Wolfe's voice, when it came, was very quiet. You did not mention this at the outset. Barstow's eyes flashed with pain and anger, because I didn't come here to be pitied or lectured. I came here because the will made the threat real. Wolfe stared at him. You have other children. Barstow's mouth compressed. A son. Michael. He is 27. Where is he? I asked. At work, Barstow said too quickly. He works for my company. And you didn't tell him? I asked. I did not, Barstow snapped, then checked himself. I wanted to protect him. Wolfe's eyes did not soften. Protection through ignorance is a sentimental fallacy. I said, Do you still have the note? Barstow nodded. In my safe. Wolfe's gaze slid to me. Archie. Yeah, I said. I hear you. Wolfe leaned back an inch, the closest he came to stretching. 2 matters, he said, lifting a finger. First, the imposture, someone using my identity 15 years ago. Second, the present maneuver, this will and its condition. They may be connected, they may not. We will assume they are, because it is prudent. He looked at Barstow. You will remain available. You will not speak to the police without consulting me. You will not confront your brother's associates. You will not attempt heroics. Barstow's mouth opened. Wolfe cut him off. If you do, I will abandon this. Do you comprehend? Barstow's shoulders stiffened, then eased a fraction. Yes. Wolfe turned to me. You will go to Mr. Barstow's office. Retrieve the note. Obtain copies of the will and any codicils. You will then speak with this attorney, Margot Vale, and this executor, Jansen. Not to accuse, to observe. I nodded, already sorting it in my head. And Lionel Cray and Dr. Mercer. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. In due time. One must not strike at all targets simultaneously. It is inefficient. Fritz appeared at Wolfe's elbow as if he'd been summoned by the word efficient, and asked softly, Sir, shall I serve the afternoon coffee? Wolfe looked at him, and for a moment there was something like gratitude, quickly buried. Yes, Fritz. Fritz left. The rosemary smell lingered a second longer, then faded. I closed my notebook and stood. All right, Mr. Barstow, let's go collect your little typed love letter. Barstow rose, and I noticed then that the careful calm he'd been wearing like a suit was starting to crease at the seams. He wasn't falling apart, but he was close enough to make mistakes. Wolfe watched him, and his voice came like a nail tapped into wood. Mr. Barstow. Barstow turned. Wolfe lifted the card I'd brought in and held it between thick fingers. You used the name Edward S. Klein? Yes. Wolfe's eyes were steady. You will tell me, now, how you knew that name would disturb me. Barstow hesitated, and the hesitation told me Wolfe had hit the right nerve. Then Barstow said, "Because 15 years ago, after I left this house, Harold Meacham called me. He apologized. He said he had sent me to the wrong man." Wolfe did not blink. Barstow continued, voice tighter. "He said the real Nero Wolfe would never have told me to stop searching. He said the man I met was a counterfeit, and he said the counterfeit's name was Edwin S. Klein." That landed with a clean finality, and for a moment the office felt smaller, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. Wolfe set the card down very carefully. "Archie," he said, and his tone had changed. Less irritation, more intent. "Take your gun." That was when I knew this wasn't just a will, and it wasn't just a missing woman. This was someone stepping into Wolfe's house, into Wolfe's life, wearing his face like a mask. And the brownstone doesn't forgive that. Wolfe telling me to take my gun is like Fritz telling me to skip lunch. It doesn't happen unless something is twisted out of its proper shape. I didn't argue. I went to the drawer, took out the .38, checked it by habit, and slipped it into the shoulder holster under my jacket. Wolfe watched with the same expression he used for my tie choices, resigned to necessity. Barstow saw the motion and went a shade paler. "Is that necessary?" Wolfe's answer was curt. "It is prudent." I said, "If it makes you feel better, I'm a terrible shot until after dinner." That didn't help. Barstow's face stayed tight, but he followed me out into the hall like a man who had finally accepted he'd stepped into a machinery room. At the front door, Fritz appeared with my coat, as if he'd been waiting for Wolfe's tone to change. He helped me into it without comment, but his eyes met mine for a second. Fritz doesn't ask questions when Wolfe is working. He asks with his eyes instead. I gave him a small nod that said, "Not your kitchen, Fritz. Not yet." Outside, January air hit like a slap. Clean, cold, and full of city noise. Barstow had come in a black sedan with a driver, the kind of arrangement that says you've been successful long enough to forget what a cab smells like. The driver opened the rear door and Barstow slid in. I got in beside him. As we pulled away, I watched the brownstone recede through the window. It looked the same as always, solid, indifferent, but I knew better. Wolfe had felt the intrusion. The house had felt it. Now it was my job to find where the knife entered. Barstow sat with his hands clasped, eyes fixed on nothing. "You believe my brother's people are involved?" "I believe Wolfe believes something," I said. That's usually enough to start with. He swallowed. "And the imposter? This Edwin Klein?" I didn't answer right away, because my brain was sorting it into piles. 15 years ago, a counterfeit Wolfe. Now, a will with a missing woman treated as alive. A typed threat. A witness signature bearing the imposter's name. The piles didn't fit neatly yet. "Tell me about Harold Meacham," I said. "The banker. What happened to him?" Barstow's mouth tightened. "He died 3 years after Helen disappeared. Stroke." "That's convenient," I muttered. Barstow heard it. He wasn't part of this. He was ashamed. He thought he'd done me harm. "Maybe he did," I said. "Maybe he did you harm by trusting the wrong man." Barstow stared out the window. He said the counterfeit was dangerous. That got my attention. "Meacham used that word?" Barstow nodded once. "He told me, after I met the man here, that he had been approached first. Klein came to the bank. He said he was affiliated with Wolfe. He spoke well. He convinced Meacham he could advise a desperate client." "Was Meacham fooled by the Wolfe Act?" I asked. "No," Barstow said. "Meacham never met Wolfe. He was fooled by confidence. That happens. New York is full of people who make a living by being certain." We pulled up at a midtown building with a lobby that smelled like marble and money. Barstow's company occupied 2 floors, and the receptionist greeted him with the strained brightness reserved for men who pay salaries. Barstow led me through to his office. It was big, clean, and too tasteful, with framed prints that looked like they'd been chosen by committee. He went to a wall safe behind a painting, of course, and spun the dial. While he worked it, I scanned the room. You learn to look for the wrong thing. A chair angled oddly. A drawer not quite shut, a paper that shouldn't be on top. Everything looked staged, but that might have been Barstow's life. The safe clicked open. Barstow took out a manila folder and handed it to me. The note is inside. I opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Typed, clean, no letterhead. The sentence sat in the middle. Stop digging. You're not the only one who can lose a daughter. No signature, no flourish. The kind of threat that didn't need decoration. I held it up near the window, angling it for watermark or indentation. Nothing obvious. I ran a thumb lightly over the paper. Standard office stock. No perfume, no grease, no fingerprints I could see. Whoever sent it had either worn gloves or was smart enough to wipe. Envelope? I asked. Barstow opened the folder again and produced it. Plain, typed address, no return. Stamp cancelled in Manhattan. Not much. I slipped the note and envelope back into the folder. We'll take this to a lab, I said, though Wolfe's lab was usually my eyes and Fritz's kitchen tongs. Barstow watched me. Do you really think... I cut him off gently. Mr. Barstow, if someone tells you to stop digging, the only reasonable response is to get a bigger shovel. His eyes flickered. Anger, fear, something like relief. My son, I know, I said. Wolfe knows. We'll handle it. He nodded, but it wasn't a confident nod. It was a man trying to nod his way out of panic. Now, I said, copies of the will. Barstow pulled another folder from the safe. This is the certified copy, and this, he handed me a second packet, is the Foundation's charter and trustees. I took them, feeling the weight of paper that could move money and people. Wills are quiet weapons. I glanced at the top page. Thomas Barstow's name, the date, witnesses, and, there it was, one witness listed as Edwin S. Klein. The other witness was a woman named Ruth Halpin. The notary was Margot Vale. I felt the pieces shift. Your brother's attorney notarized the will and is a trustee, I said. Barstow's mouth tightened. Yes. That's not illegal, I said, but it's like a referee betting on the game. Barstow's phone rang. He snatched it up, listened, then looked at me with a face that had gone tight as wire. Michael, he said, my son. He wants to come in. I held up a hand. Don't put him off too hard. That raises alarms. Tell him you're in a meeting. Barstow did, voice controlled. He hung up and stared at the desk. He's perceptive. He'll know something is wrong. Let him be perceptive, I said. Just don't let him be alone. Barstow looked up sharply. You think... I think whoever sent that note didn't type it for fun, I said. Now, where is your brother's townhouse? East 69th, you said. Yes. And who has access? I asked. Keys, codes, staff. Barstow hesitated. Thomas kept a housekeeper, a manservant too. He liked the appearance of old ways. The staff remained after his death under the executor's control. Names, I said. Housekeeper is Elena Rios. The man is Malcolm Fenn. I wrote them down. All right, here's what we do. You stay put for the next couple hours. You don't go home alone. You don't send your son away alone. You keep your driver, and if you have security, you use it. Barstow bristled. I'm not helpless. No, I agreed, but you're a target. There's a difference. I stood, tucking the folders under my arm. I'm going to see Margot Vale. Barstow's eyes widened slightly. She won't talk. She doesn't have to, I said. She just has to exist in the same room as me. People tell you things without realizing it, if you watch them hard enough. He leaned forward. Mr. Goodwin, Archie, If you find something, if you learn Helen is alive. My throat tightened a fraction, because there are questions like that make you feel your own humanity when you'd rather be a machine. I said, then we'll find out why your brother wrote her into a will like a chess piece. And if she's dead? I met his eyes. Then we'll find out who's been using her name as leverage. Either way, somebody's been lying for 15 years. He nodded once, slow. On my way out, I passed the receptionist and caught her watching me with that curious look people give when they see trouble walk through a rich man's office without knocking. I gave her a smile that said, "Don't worry, it won't be your problem." It probably would be. Outside, I waved off the driver. I wanted my own movement. I flagged a cab and headed downtown to the address on Vale's letterhead, an old law firm building where the elevators move like they're charging by the floor. While the cab crawled through traffic, I read the will more carefully. Thomas Barstow's language was dry, legal, but there were little edges, phrases that felt personal, almost taunting. The condition about Helen wasn't written like a gift, it was written like a dare, and the phrase about lilacs by the north wall sat there like a private joke. By the time I reached the law office, I had one clear thought. Thomas Barstow had wanted someone to look. Maybe he wanted Daniel to look. Maybe he wanted the trustees to scramble. Maybe he wanted Helen, if she existed, to come running. Or maybe he wanted all of them to dance while the foundation took the prize. The receptionist at Vale's firm looked up, saw my face, and started to do the polite barrier routine. I gave her my best Archie Goodwin grin, friendly, confident, mildly irritating. "Archie Goodwin," I said. "Tell Miss Vale it concerns the Barstow will. If she doesn't see me, I'll sit here and make her waiting room feel like a bus station." The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone. She murmured into it. A moment later, a door opened down the hall, and a woman stepped out. Margot Vale was in her 40s, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed, the kind of lawyer who made you feel she could bill you for breathing her air. She looked at me like a file she'd rather not open. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, and the fact she knew my name told me she was already nervous. I smiled wider. "Ms. Vale, thanks for seeing me. I promised to be brief." Her eyes flicked to the folders under my arm. "This is inappropriate." "Maybe," I said, "but so is notarizing a will you're invested in. Yet here we are." Her jaw tightened, just a fraction. "Come in." As I followed her into her office, I felt the city outside keep moving, indifferent. But inside that room, with the door closing behind me, the air had the same tightness as Wolfe's office, only without the orchids. And that meant one thing. Someone was already afraid of what Wolfe might do from his chair. Which meant we were on the right scent. By the time we reached the Barstow townhouse, the street had the look of a place that had learned to keep its mouth shut. East 69th always did. Old money doesn't gossip. It just remembers. The driver double-parked without apology. Cray was out first, moving fast, coat flapping like moral outrage. Jansen followed, jaw set. I came last, hand inside my coat, not touching the gun but aware of it, the way you're aware of a staircase when you're carrying something fragile. Inside, the house felt wrong. Not wrecked, just disturbed, like a mind after a bad thought. Elena Rios stood near the foot of the stairs, hands clasped, eyes wide. Malcolm Fenn hovered behind her, trying to look useful and failing. Cray demanded explanations. Elena gave them in a rush. She'd gone out for groceries. When she returned, the study door was ajar, drawers open, papers moved, and yes, the garden. Someone had been digging by the north wall. "Did you see anyone?" I asked. "No," she said. "But I heard a car earlier. Black. I thought it was Mr. Jansen." Jansen stiffened. It wasn't. I let that sit. Then I said, "Show me the study." The study was neat again. too neat. Someone had closed drawers hastily, not carefully. That's a difference you learn to spot. On the desk, a paperweight sat at a new angle, like it had been set down by a hand that didn't know the habits of the room. I crossed to the desk, opened the center drawer, and found what I expected, an empty space shaped like a small framed photograph. I looked at Jansen. "Where's the picture?" His eyes flicked away. "What picture?" "The one Thomas kept," I said. "Helen?" "Same one Barstow gave to a counterfeit Wolfe 15 years ago." Cray snapped. "That's ridiculous." "Sure," I said. "Except Klein asked Vale about photographs last week, and someone dug up the garden today, right where a sentimental old man once planted lilacs with a missing girl." Jansen's control cracked. "You have no proof?" "Not yet," I agreed. "But Wolfe does." That got their attention. Cray sneered. "Wolfe isn't here." "No," I said. "He's never here. That's the point." I pulled out my phone and dialed the brownstone. Wolfe answered on the first ring. "Yes, Archie." "We're in the study," I said. "Drawers disturbed. Garden dug. The photograph's missing." "Excellent," Wolfe said calmly. "Then the matter is ripe." Cray leaned in. "You're discussing this with him now?" "Yes," I said. "He dislikes waiting when people are busy incriminating themselves." Wolfe's voice came through the speaker, measured and precise. "Mr. Cray, Mr. Jansen, you will listen." Cray bristled. "This is absurd." Wolfe cut him off. 15 years ago, a man calling himself Edwin S. Klein sat behind my desk. He did so because he wished to borrow my authority. He required a stage, and my brownstone provided it." Jansen went pale. Wolfe continued, "That man was introduced to Mr. Barstow by a banker who trusted confidence over verification. Mr. Klein obtained information and a photograph. He then disappeared." Cray snapped. "Conjecture." "Fact," Wolfe said. "The photograph was later used to persuade Thomas Barstow that Helen Barstow yet lived. Mr. Cray, you are an idealist with a talent for acquisition. You convinced Thomas that his house would better serve the public than his brother, but you required leverage." Cray's mouth opened, then closed. Wolfe went on. "Mr. Jansen, you provided access, keys, staff, schedules. You enjoy control. You enjoy being indispensable. You are not imaginative enough to invent the scheme, but you are practical enough to execute it." Jansen barked. "You can't prove?" "I can," Wolfe said, "because Helen Barstow is alive." The silence that followed was absolute. Cray whispered, "That's impossible." "No," Wolfe said, "it is merely inconvenient. Helen Barstow was alive when Mr. Klein obtained her photograph. She was alive when Thomas Barstow was persuaded to write his will. And she is alive now under another name, residing in a private facility recommended by Dr. Sloane Mercer." Cray turned slowly. "Mercer?" "A psychiatrist," Wolfe said. "A useful profession for explaining why a woman might wish to disappear or be encouraged to remain disappeared. Helen Barstow was persuaded, initially, to withdraw. Later, when persuasion waned, confinement was justified as care." Helena gasped. Malcolm swore softly. Jansen shook his head. "You're insane." Wolfe's voice sharpened. "No, you are desperate. Today, you believed Helen's location, or proof of her death, might be concealed in the garden, prompted by Thomas's childish sentiment. You sent Mr. Klein to search." Cray snapped. "Klein is dead." There it was. I looked at Cray. "Care to repeat that?" He froze. Wolfe said, "Indeed, Edwin S. Klein died 12 years ago. Stroke. Quiet. Documented. His name was resurrected because dead men cannot contradict." Jansen sagged. Wolfe finished. "The impostor was not Klein. He was your associate, Mr. Cray. A man you trusted with theatrics. He borrowed a dead name, borrowed my identity, and borrowed a girl's life." Cray's voice shook. "We were preserving the house." Wolfe snorted. You were preserving your appetites. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had finally called the police. Good. Wolfe preferred conclusions that came with paperwork. Wolfe said, Archie, escort Mr. Cray and Mr. Jansen to the anteroom of justice. Ensure they do not flee. Gladly, I said, pocketing the phone. Cray didn't resist. He just looked old. Jansen looked relieved, which told me guilt had been heavy. Later, much later, the brownstone was quiet again. Dinner had been served. Fritz's sauce was perfect as always. Wolfe ate with the concentration of a man restoring balance. I leaned back and said, Helen's with her father now, shaken, angry, alive. Wolfe nodded once. Appropriate. And the foundation? Dissolved, Wolfe said. A fitting end for an edifice built on appropriation. I grinned. You know, someone wore your face and borrowed your name. That doesn't happen often. Wolfe sipped his beer. No, it is why I objected. Not the crime, I said. The audacity. Wolfe regarded me. Mr. Goodwin, when a man steals bread, one may argue necessity. When he steals a name, he reveals vanity. I stood. Anything else? Yes, Wolfe said. Remind me to change nothing. I nodded. Wouldn't dream of it. Upstairs, the orchid slept. The brownstone held its breath no longer. And somewhere in the city, a name that shouldn't exist had finally been laid to rest without ever earning a chair.